From Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Party's progressive wing has been met with great success. While Joe Biden, the party's presidential nominee, continues to be the flag bearer for the moderate wing of the party, he does so on an increasingly progressive platform. Is this realignment the route to success in 2020? To answer these questions, I'm joined by Justin Buoen, who was the campaign manager for Amy Klobuchar's bid for the 2020 Democratic nomination for president. He previously served on Klobuchar's 2 successful senatorial campaigns. I'm also joined by Peter Baker, an American journalist serving as the White House correspondent for the New York Times and political analyst for the NBC. I'm also joined by Clare Malone, senior political writer at FiveThirtyEight, with whom she covered the 2016 election of Donald Trump. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. I wanted to start the conversation by talking about the 2018 midterms, which were considered to be this huge initial victory for the progressive wing of the party, with victories for AOC and the Big Four, among others. Equally, however, the moderate wing of the party, with the new Democratic coalition, saw huge victories. So how would you sum up the story of the 2018 midterms and the Democratic Party that came out of it? And do you think it was actually that big progressive moment we all talked about at the time?
Yeah, hey, thank you very much for having me. Very honored to be participating in this program, and I'm delighted to have the chance to do it, even though we're obviously all not together. I wish we were. It would be a more fun experience. We'll make the most of this as we can by video. Yeah, I think the 2018 elections were important. I don't know whether or not, in and of itself, we should consider that a seismic change or part of a larger evolution. I mean, I think that what you're seeing in the Democratic Party, obviously, is a younger and more liberal generation trying to assert itself. But 2018 was also a reaction to President Trump as much as anything else. And I think that one election in one district or a few elections in a few districts can be over magnified, right? AOC certainly was very headline grabbing. She performed a remarkable victory over an entrenched incumbent. Obviously, you can't minimize that, but her district in New York is not the same as districts, across the 50 states. And so it's a temptation to try to draw larger lessons from that or from her colleagues, several other more progressive Democrats like herself who won. At the same time, you have the spam burgers in Virginia or in Michigan and other places where more moderate, security-oriented Democrats won. And I think that they would claim that the middle of the road or the more moderate version of things was the path to their success. I think it really depends on districts. Now, what you're seeing within the party, I think, is a larger debate. And the question of this debate is taking place against the backdrop of Trump as president. And that's warping it to some extent, right? What does the Democratic Party stand for in the post-Obama era is an important debate for the party to have. The question then becomes, how do you have that at the same time your primary goal is to take back the White House from Donald Trump? When is that debate appropriate to have? Should it be held now, or should the larger mission from the Democratic point of view be to win this election and then try to define what they stand for? The question for a lot of people you saw, I think, in 2018 and you saw in the primaries in 2020 is, policy versus winning an election against a person who is seen as anathema to the party, whether it be moderates or progressives.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Peter said about the midterm election being a reaction to Donald Trump is very true, and it's very true for most midterm elections, right? We can look back and see, the 2010 midterms being a big reaction to Obama, right? The rise of the Tea Party. So we see these, in the American psyche, and probably a lot of places, this kind of whiplash that happens in the 2018 midterms. I would actually encourage, we're probably speaking to a primarily British audience here. I would encourage people to read a very good article that was in Peter's newspaper by Susan Dominus that focused in on the newbie 2018 freshman class in Congress, particularly a few women. And it kind of talked about, Ayanna Pressley, one of the quote unquote squad, right? So more liberal, progressive congresswoman. And then, just talking about the Spanbergers, right? The idea that there was quite a breadth of ideology within that 2018 up and coming class. And I think the idea that America is beholden to two political parties basically accounts for a lot of the diversity in who was elected in the 2018 midterms. I think, you know, regional stereotypes are often true in America, right? There are the Northeastern liberal congressional districts, and there are the moderate Midwestern ones. I mean, Nancy Pelosi went out of her way to talk about this when she was talking about her caucus. It's that, you know, you kind of have to tailor your candidate to the place where they're running. And I think the one thing that perhaps the through line, if we want to connect 2018 to 2016 to 2020, is the idea of electability and the idea of we just want someone who will perhaps, from the Democratic point of view, restore us to a certain sense of pre-Donald Trump normalcy. I mean, that's the entire premise of Joe Biden's campaign, right? Is that he's a comforting figure of both ideology, right? Even though he is in the spectrum of Democratic ideology throughout history, pretty progressive. He also kind of has those, for lack of a better phrase, white male identity politics that comfort a lot of voters. And a lot of politics is about gut instinct, and I call it political pheromones. It's kind of who you know, you're picking up what they're putting down, and you can't quite put your finger on it. And Joe Biden kind of has that comforting presence for a lot of Democrats. So I would say, ultimately, if you want to sum it all up, it's a reaction to Donald Trump.
Justin, could you comment on that, and especially pick up on what Claire just said about Joe Biden?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both what Claire and Peter said, but one more broader point, I think, for the Democratic Party here. In 2018, we picked up 41 seats across the country. As was pointed out, it's everyone from AOC to some of the more conservative members in Minnesota, my home state. We've got Ilhan Omar, who represents Minneapolis, one of the most progressive districts in the country, and Colin Peterson, whose district Donald Trump won by double digits, and I think is the most conservative district in the country that has a Democratic representative in it. And I think what that illuminates is that the Democratic Party is a much broader, bigger tent than the Republican Party, and this is going to be one of the advantages that we're going to have, I think, going forward. That continued in 2019 when we won governor's races in Kentucky and Louisiana, places that are traditionally considered Democratic strongholds by any extent. And so I think that this diverse opinions and the diversity within our party is one of our greatest strengths heading into the primaries, or heading out of the primaries and into the general election. And I think it's going to serve the vice president well when it comes to November. It's also going to serve some of these Senate challengers that we've got in the Democratic field this cycle. Looks like we're probably going to do well in places like Arizona and Colorado and Montana, North Carolina, all states that have progressive cities and some base, but also have moderate voters. And we've got candidates that are appealing to all of them.
I just wanted to touch now on the impact that progressive groups such as Justice Democrats specifically have had on the party, and whether they've kind of been instrumental in changing the narrative, or whether the impact has been kind of any wider or deeper than that. So Claire, perhaps you wanted to pick up on that?
Sure. I mean, Justice Democrats, you know, you'll talk to them and they'll say, or Waleed Shahid, who was for a time their comms director or their spokesperson, love to give the example. Our historical example is the radical Republicans during the Civil War, right? The idea that Justice Democrats, their entire purpose is to primary Democrats who they feel aren't progressive enough, right? They say that they embrace comparisons to the Tea Party, right? This idea that we are here to be your moral compass of your party. That's fine with us. The radical Republicans were these anti-abolitionists, really hardcore, pushing Lincoln, pushing the party to be more moral, quote unquote, right? So in the case of slavery, I think we're safe on that. But in the case of Justice Democrats, that's their entire purpose, is to be a bit of a rabble-rousing upstart activist group. And I think what's been interesting, obviously AOC was their big candidate, right? But what has been interesting is that AOC is certainly an unconventional politician in a lot of ways, but she's also a politician, right? She's also played some of the caucus politics that she needs to play, right? She's been very careful in a lot of ways about what she says about Nancy Pelosi. So I think, you know, once you get people in the halls of power, they do tend to behave a little bit differently than they would when they're out there campaigning. But Justice Democrats has certainly, you know, put a face to, you know, they're both Gen Z people. You know, their executive director is quite a young woman. A lot of the older members of the staff are kind of older millennials, so which is to say, not very old at all, but people who have come of age in the shadow of the Great Recession of 2008. The idea that they are reflecting a lot of these the distrust in institutions that I think you can go back and look at Gallup polling and see, well, distrust in the Supreme Court started after the 2000 election decision. But then you see huge dips in trust all over the place starting in 2008. You had, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, all of those activist movements kind of come to rest, I think, in Bernie Sanders' campaign and then groups like Justice Democrats. So it's basically the kind of the channeling of those outside left movements and climate movements too. And I think that's going to be a factor of the party going forward for the next couple of decades. And we're just seeing sort of the nascent stages of it.
Peter, Justin, I wanted to go to you now to talk about some of the legislative successes that the progressive wing of the party might have had in the past 2 years, especially. So when you consider policies such as Medicare for All and the Green New Deal, how much kind of have they dominated the narrative, and to what extent have they seen successes in the legislature? Does political influence outside of Washington translate into legislative victories necessarily? So going to you perhaps first, Peter.
Yeah, look, have they passed any of these big, sweeping, ambitious ideas? No, they've got a Republican Senate. That hasn't happened. And that won't happen as long as there's a Republican Senate or, and certainly a Republican like President Trump in the White House. But that doesn't mean it's not important, because obviously it has, I think, shifted the center of gravity of the party. It shifted the debate. The debate is no longer, in 2010, 2009, when President Obama was trying to pass his healthcare plan, the notion that a public option, that is to say, an option that people could have of a government-run healthcare as opposed to a private insurance plan, which they could choose if they wanted to. The very notion of a public option was ruled by the Obama administration to be too controversial to pass, even among Democrats and a Democratic Congress. And so they tossed that out, even though President Obama had promised that during his campaign. Well, look where we are 10 years later. We're not just talking about a public option. We're talking about only a public option if you go with Medicare for all. And the more conservative, moderate position, if you want to call it that, was taken by the presidential candidates who said, no, that's too far. Let's do the public option as the more conservative of the two options on the plate. So that's how much the center of gravity has changed within the Democratic Party. Now, of course, that promotes the possibility of attacks by the Democrats by the Republicans of socialism. I think you had at one point seen the likelihood of a campaign waged this year on that front. You would have seen Trump and the Republicans talk about socialism as one of their main thrusts for this fall. But that, of course, has now been upended by the collapse of the economy and the coronavirus pandemic that has so radically changed the conversation in the United States. Whether or not a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president could actually pass Medicare for all, that's a big question. I don't know that. There's still, again, a lot of Democrats who are wary of that, who think that's going too far. Again, I think Justin's candidate among them during the primaries suggested that was perhaps a step too far, further than the country was ready to go at this point, and that there were other ways of getting at some of the same issues. But I do think that they have shifted the debate, and that's important. And these big questions, these big ideas, often in Washington take years, if not decades, to metastasize into something actually legislative in component. It took between Teddy Roosevelt and Barack Obama to get to something even coming closer to it, a universal health care plan. It didn't actually achieve universal health care, but it came closer to that. Many presidents between them tried it. Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Richard Nixon actually proposed a sweeping health care plan, obviously Bill Clinton. So it'd take a while in American politics to gin up the kind of energy and support and consensus for these kind of big ideas. So the fact that it hasn't happened in the short term doesn't really necessarily measure its importance.
I think that's right. I think not only has there been a shift within the Democratic Party, and we saw that on the debate stage at every one of those Democratic debates throughout the course of the presidential campaign, but I think that there's been a public opinion shift in a lot of these areas, and it's to the credit of some of the progressive members and the progressive groups. I mean, we've seen now polling that suggests that people want to believe that healthcare is a right, and they want to see bold action taken on climate change, and they want to bring down the cost of of college or make college free, whether it's for 2-year community college or for 4-year universities. And so I think that the progressive movement has not only moved the Democratic Party establishment to the left for the betterment of the country, if we're able to take control of the Senate and implement some of these policies, but also move public opinion. Now, there's definitely some variance and differences in the details, as Peter pointed out, whether it's Medicare for all and public option, or whether it's a 2-year college or a 4-year college, and absolutely that's some of the sausage making that will get worked out in the legislative process. But there has been a positive, I think, shift both publicly with moderate and swing voters in districts that Democrats need to win to hold the House and to win back the White House, and the party as a whole. I mean, the biggest takeaway for me out of the presidential election was just how quickly the party came together. I mean, I think the fact that Senator Sanders endorsed Vice President Biden so quickly after Super Tuesday, only a couple of contests after, much earlier than I think any of us would have predicted, and much earlier than usually happens in presidential primaries, shows that the party's united, and the progressive wing of the party has I think a vocal and active voice within the Biden campaign. Just this week or last week, the Sanders and Biden campaigns announced a task force to make sure to implement some of the positions that more progressive members of the party have been pushing for, with Vice President's platform and pushing for that at the convention, chaired by AOC and John Kerry. So kind of the two standard bearers of the two wings of the party right now, and I think the unity that we're seeing is something that is going to be a great strength going into November.
I think that leads me very nicely, actually, to talking about Biden and his policies themselves. And I did actually just want to have a conversation about how progressive you think Biden's policies actually are. So starting with healthcare, Biden's healthcare plan, I believe, includes lowering the Medicare age to 60 instead of the existing 65, promises widespread reform to the Affordable Care Act, and so on. So even though it's not Medicare for all, I just wanted to ask, maybe starting with you, Claire, do you think this marks a significant shift to the left?
No, not per se. I mean, I think just to go back a bit, the idea that Biden, there was this very short period where everyone thought Bernie Sanders was going to be the nominee, and then the South Carolina primary happened, and very quickly the primary entirely shifted. And I think that's a result of, yes, the party deciding, right? Party officials like Amy Klobuchar, deciding to drop out to endorse Biden, but Black voters who in South Carolina, who tend to be more moderate voters right now, basically saying, we don't want Bernie Sanders. We don't think he can win. So I think the party is actually decently moderate still, or moderate by 2020 standards, which is to say, it actually has quite a lot of progressive policy points in its platform. I mean, Hillary Clinton's campaign would go back and tell you that 2016 was the most progressive presidential party platform that the Democrats have ever had. And I think Biden's platform is kind of the 2020 version of the 2016 progressivism, right? Which is to say, Biden knows that he needs to embrace some of the Sanders and Warren progressive points of view, because a lot of 2016 Clinton voters who said, I'll never vote for Bernie Sanders, in the 4 years intervening sort of said, well, actually some of these progressive policy ideas make a lot of sense. I think what Joe Biden's policies marry is the sense of pragmatism that is sort of permeating the environment right now. Because I think what Medicare for All's big problem is a problem of imagination, right? Is that the public can't quite imagine what a Medicare for All country looks like in the span of 2 years or 4 years, right? When you actually, once we got past the sort of the slogan of Medicare for All and people started to sit down and think about it and sort of hear on recurring debate stages, I don't think they were getting the clear vision of what it actually would look like, which I think makes people revert a little bit to, well, let's go with the incrementalism. So I guess, you know, if you wanted to call it incrementalism, I guess that's what you could call Biden's plan, although it's the idea of building out on a healthcare system that I think for a lot of people, I mean, again, go back to the 2010 midterms, was this, you know, sea change moment in American life. So I'm sure Joe Biden's, you know, policy people would take issue with the incrementalism, but I do think that's what it is.
Peter, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think Joe, when he becomes president, if he wins, and you know, you're not looking for transformation of a society from a Joe Biden at age 78. That's not his nature. It's not his history. It's not his instinct. He is by definition and history an incrementalist. For the most part, I think he's somebody who lives in the realm of what I can actually get through Congress. When President Obama was having trouble figuring out how to, you know, unlock the House and the Senate, it was Biden he sent over there to figure out how to do it. That's where he comes from. And I don't think it's his nature to, you know, Biden is not a revolutionary. What he's in fact promising is not revolution. What he's promising is the opposite. What he's promising the country, in effect, is let's get back to the sort of norms and standards and values that we had prior to Trump. And then we can debate these issues about the best way to get healthcare, the best way to, you know, to talk about the budget or social safety networks or defense and security, internationalism, climate change, all these issues that will be out there. In effect, his message is these are important, but more important than any one of them, more important than what specifically I might do with any of them, is that we get back to some form of where we were 3 years ago, prior to 3 years ago. Now, whether that's realistic, I don't know. I mean, the country is different than it was, and it's not just about President Trump. President Trump reflects part of the country, a significant part of the country. He's not, you know, he's never once gotten the support of a majority of the public. He's the first president in our history, this is the history of polling, never to have an approval rating that top 50% in the major polls. But he represents a good 40-some% of the public. And that is represented probably disproportionately within Congress. So Joe Biden knows that. He understands that he's not going to come in with what he thinks are pie in the sky ideas that aren't going to be able to pass. If he were to become president, and we don't know that he will, but if he were to become president, I would look to him to be, you know, more targeted and more strategic in the things that he tries to pursue. Obviously, more liberal leaning than not, but you know, he's not a revolutionary.
I mean, I think that's right. If you look at Joe Biden's legislative record, I mean, he is a person that looks for consensus and looks to get things done and accomplish things. And I think that's also what you want to see in your president. You want to have someone that can actually move the needle and affect change and make a difference in people's lives. And so he's not going to propose positions just for the sake of proposing them and letting them die in the first 100 days. He's gonna push policies that can make a difference. And we're going to have it. You know, it's going to be an incredible time coming out of this next election, and there's going to be a lot of work that's going to need to be done in the Senate and the House. And for the next president, we're going to be coming out of the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. And I think that there's going to be some opportunities that come along with that and transforming and changing some of the systems. And that's what the vice president has talked about, I think, more recently. And I think that we'll see some of those changes if Democrats win in November. So
changing the subject slightly, I think in 2020 more than ever, the climate vote is incredibly important. And I did want to have a discussion about Biden's climate plan, which promises something like $1.7 trillion in investment into climate change and net zero emissions by 2050. So I wonder what you make of the response that Biden has had from the climate voters around the country. Claire, going to you.
Well, I guess since a lot of climate, if we're talking about people whose primary issue is climate, which I guess is what we mean by climate voters, a lot of those people are young people. This is not to say that there aren't older people who care about climate change as first and foremost on their ticket, but you know, the Sunrise Movement, which is the big climate change movement in the United States, is a primarily, I would say, a young person's movement. So those are people who I think we could kind of caricature as former Bernie Sanders supporters. they're not huge Joe Biden fans, right? Joe Biden hasn't exactly been the young person's candidate. And I think his campaign has, during the primaries, they were not particularly bent on winning over young voters. In fact, when you talk to the campaign, sometimes the language they used to talk about young voters was often, well, they don't realize whose shoulders they're standing on. It was kind of this defensive position that they had to young voters not embracing Biden as their candidate. I think they realize that they do need to, if only for PR effect, win those voters over and, accede to the very real problems of climate change, the very real idea that it is becoming a more important issue in the Democratic Party, if not the country as a whole. But I'd also say, if we're going to pure electoral strategy, young people don't vote as much as older people do. And so I think Joe Biden, when he gives a stump speech, he'll certainly talk about climate change, but it's not going to be the number one thing that you're going to see him talking about. I think it's going to be something that is parceled out in very specific ways, and will certainly, we can talk about the Paris Climate Accords, and I think there'll be a lot of talk following the COVID-19 quarantines. You see the sort of net carbon emissions going way, 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 way down, and people talking about what's within the realm of the possible in curbing climate change and carbon emissions. But I do think from just a purely, we need to win November, Joe Biden going out there and talking about electric cars for all probably won't win him the 6 or 7 swing states that he needs to win in order to get the Electoral College.
Justin, if I could just bring you in here, did you want to respond to what Claire has just said about electoral strategy and climate?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that generally speaking, it's younger voters that put that at the top of their list. But bold action on climate change is something that we heard across the country on the stump, and we've seen in all the polling data. And I think that there is an understanding by Democrats and moderates that needs to be some action. And what the Trump administration has done with deregulation and the types of people that they've put in positions of power in some of the regulatory agencies has been appalling. And I do think that there is some political hay to be made there, even in swing states for the Biden campaign. And so I think there's a way to talk about the importance of bold action on climate change without turning off suburban voters, but also getting younger people excited. I do think, and I mentioned this before, but it's important. I mean, Bernie Sanders, AOC, the Democratic Party is in lockstep behind Joe Biden and is going to do everything they can to turn out those voters that may prefer their positions over his positions, but understand that this election is a referendum on Donald Trump. I mean, our choices are Joe Biden, progressive that is going to get things done, or 4 years of Donald Trump. And I think that is going to resonate with voters in the base that maybe had different primary candidates that they were supporting.
Peter, just going to you now. I wanted to touch slightly on immigration. So you talked about this kind of this return to this values-based presidency that Biden promises. And in line with that, he has been extremely vocal of his criticism of Trump's immigration policy and the narrative that the Trump administration has against kind of dreamers and immigrants and so on. And this includes kind of the criticism of the COVID-19 executive order. What are we to expect from Biden in terms of immigration during the campaign and also from a potential Biden presidency?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that goes to some of the earlier discussion about where the center of gravity in the party is. What you're hearing Biden do today is distance himself not just from President Trump's approach to immigration, but even President Obama's approach to immigration. He's distanced himself, for instance, from the 3 million deportations that were carried out under President Obama. That's seen as, a record to regret rather than boast about in the Democratic Party right now. That will be one of the issues that will be addressed in the fall. But I think that it would be more about, like climate, immigration is one of those issues that probably would have been more defining prior to this COVID-19 pandemic. And today will be, the way things look today, maybe things will be looking different in October, but will be part of a statement of values by the candidates, but not by themselves the center issues, right? What Biden and Trump will do to their various voters is talk about deregulation in Trump's side, or climate on Biden's side, and in terms of how far to go on immigration in terms of their various voters, to speak to them about what they care about, to speak to them about what matters to them in a way of values, rather than specific plans, rather than specific, I'll do this, I'll do that. You may hear talk about the wall and all that, but the truth is it's about values in a tribal moment in our country. Which side are you on? All of that, though, is subsidiary or secondary, I think, at this point, to these broader questions of what we're doing about this pandemic and the economy coming out of it. If we are in fact coming out of it, this fall is going to look. We have no idea what this fall is going to look like. We can make predictions here today, but let's be honest, we just don't know. If, in fact, we are moving past the pandemic and we are able to reopen safely and we are able to begin shifting the economy back into forward, does that help Trump in the sense that there is a feeling of momentum of coming back? Can he make the argument that I'm the one who built the economy before, if actually that's not true, but let's just say that's the argument he's going to make, I'm the one who can therefore rebuild it? Or will the virus be having a second wave? Will there be a whole new need to close back down again parts of society because we did it too quickly? And in that case, of course, it's going to be very bad for President Trump as well as bad for the country as a whole, because the economy won't come back if people don't believe the virus is under control. And so this is going to be so overarching, so overwhelming, that everything else is going to be, I think, part of the larger value statement, but not the center of the debate.
Justin, going back to you again, I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about how you see the campaign kind of adapting to and tailoring its strategy around the pandemic, and what you expect from the campaign over the next 6 months.
Well, I was speaking with Jen O'Malley Dillon, the campaign manager for the Biden campaign, the other day, and just saying how I feel for her. I mean, trying to run a national campaign from the vice president's basement is incredibly difficult, and we're playing by a new set of rules. There's no doubt about it, and I think it's a challenge for both the campaigns. I mean, one of the great things that the Biden campaign has had going for them is that Donald Trump has been going in front of the TV cameras and showing that his administration is incompetent every day. And to Peter's point about we definitely don't know what things are going to look like come November, but the president had a real missed opportunity here. I mean, number of these governors across the country that are showing true leadership, and some of these other world leaders have seen big spikes in their approval ratings, 12-15% in some of those, and the president's approval on FiveThirtyEight this morning was at 43%. So I think that that has helped the Biden campaign definitely. But back to just the pure tactics and how you run a campaign. I think they're experimenting with these virtual travels to states and trying to focus on issues that matter. I think you do as much as you can with local TV interviews as possible, and that's what the vice president's campaign's been doing. And then talk to voters where they are, right? And that's doing these Zoom meetings, that's doing teleconferences, that's engaging people that way, and maybe there'll be an opportunity to talk with more swing voters and base turnout voters this way than going door to door or hoping people come to a rally, because it's so much easier to do from your home. But we're all definitely playing from a new set of rules, and it's going to be a lot of trial and error for both campaigns.
Claire, going to you, I just wonder if you could tell us about what the response has been like to this virtual socially distanced campaign, and also I wonder what you generally make of the impact the pandemic will have on the race.
Yeah, I mean, to echo what everyone says, who knows? But I do think, the interesting thing that Justin brings up is the idea of, first of all, we're in a certain phase of the campaign where Trump is just on TV all the time, not being trusted by the public or sort of saying crazy things like drink bleach, which is great for Joe Biden and his sort of under the radar campaign. Where I think you start to see problems is a couple months down the line when the country starts to open up a little bit more, and then you need to figure out, okay, how do we balance this? And I think that the Biden campaign has seen some vocal raising of those issues by, for instance, David Axelrod and Plouffe, people who are involved in Obama's campaign, saying we can't do this forever, right? We can't have the basement campaign forever. I think the challenge of having a distant campaign is, and this goes for Trump too, candidates go to swing states and have rallies and, you know, do meet and greet events largely to stir up local media coverage. I mean, if you look at the political science of campaigning, the reason why candidates do that is so they can be on the 6 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news and say, hey, Joe Biden came to Cuyahoga County and he really cares, and he talked to, you know, so-and-so. I go to so-and-so's auto shop too. Wow, that's crazy. That's cool. The election is right here on my door, and the news anchors I trust actually talk to Joe Biden. He cares. That is the purpose of those campaign events. And when local news doesn't have that, you know, B-roll to show, that actually does, I think, have this significant effect. So that's one part, the kind of, you know, the earned media part, right? We all heard a lot about earned media and Donald Trump in 2016. You know, how do you kind of make, you know, without spending ad dollars, how do you make voters pay attention to you? So that's one problem. The problem I think I still don't know the answer to is how does organizing and get out the vote go on in a pandemic? I mean, you know, maybe we won't have that big of a hitch in all of that. Maybe we're such a digitized society, and the COVID pandemic will push it forward that we don't really need to, you know, worry too much about get out the vote for a political campaign. But I kind of doubt that's the case. And then you also have the whole idea of parties. Most of the Democratic Party needs to worry about all of these rules around vote by mail, and not just, you know, the president's tweeting a lot about ballots being mailed to people. Set that aside, which is actually not true. Michigan wasn't mailing people absentee ballots, but these rules around how votes are actually counted. So if you mail in your vote, does it need to be received by the Board of Election on election day, or does it need to be postmarked by election day? How are the signatures signed, right? All this stuff that's very boring when you talk about it in the abstract, but it actually will mean quite a bit on election day. You know, whether or not ballots can be picked up by campaign groups. You know, the Republicans call it ballot harvesting. The Democrats, I don't think, have a very succinct phrase for it. But the idea that there's a lot of new questions around what will November's election even look like, and what will the litigation surrounding all this stuff look like. So I think those things, we're in a particular like TV phase right now where it's like Joe Biden from the basement, which is funny, I think, from a certain point of view, right? We're running a presidential campaign from someone's residential basement. But what are the next 4 months, you know, what do the 4 months before the election look like? That's the really big question that I think the campaigns are all thinking about right now.
Peter, I wondered if you wanted to add to this question of kind of the technicalities of voting.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, this is going to reform or revolutionize in some ways how we look at elections. We've been moving toward absentee or mail-in voting for a long time. 5 states basically do pretty much all mail voting as it is, and Republicans, just like Democrats in the state level, have been promoting it and you know, making it easier and trying to get their organizations structured in order to try to take advantage of it. 31 states, I think, currently have either all mail voting or no excuse, what they call no excuse absentee voting, which means you can vote absentee without having to give a reason. You know, in the old days, and in many states, you'd have to give a justification for why you needed a mail-in ballot. So this is going to make everybody rethink things. But I don't know that, you know, the president is acting as if he knows that mail-in voting is bad for him and bad for Republicans. I'm not 100% sure he's right about that. The truth is, there's a mixed bag here. There's some advantage. There's some examples you can point to and say, aha, this is obviously a good thing for Democrats. You point to that Wisconsin Supreme Court election recently, where people had to come out. Actually, some did came out. Many came out during the pandemic in person, but a lot came in through mail-in. You also saw a congressional seat just flip from Democrat to Republican in California, largely mail-in election. So I think he may be, he may be undermining his own party's efforts to try to win through this this technique, this method of voting. But I think the assumption is that the higher turnout there is, the worse it is for President Trump. And so that's underlying his attacks on Michigan and Nevada. He did not attack Republican states. They're doing the exact same thing, of course. He's only attacking states that he perceives to be swing states, states that he thinks he might lose in. So we'll see. We are seeing an election that has no historical template. We cannot point to a previous election and say, well, this is a lot like the blah, blah, blah race between so-and-so and so-and-so, because dynamics are so radically different because of the pandemic, because of the economic collapse, because of this notion of fear over showing up to vote in person. Joe Biden in the basement is kind of a funny meme. At what point does it make him look marginal? Does it minimize him as a stat, in terms of stature, or does it save him from being out in the stump and exhausting himself and making gaffes that would actually hurt him at this stage of the campaign? I think you could look at it either way. We don't know, and we ought to be careful about making predictions, because obviously a lot of us made predictions 4 years ago and were wrong, and this year the dynamics are even more out of the ordinary.
Thank you. I wanted to turn the conversation now to talking about the allegation of sexual harassment made by Tara Reade against Joe Biden, which has raised several questions for obviously Joe Biden himself, his campaign, but also for the Democrats who had adopted the Me Too message of believing victims as one of their own. So I wonder what you make of the Democrats' response to the allegations so far. And Claire, I wanted to start with you on this one.
Sure. I mean, if we're setting aside I think we should stipulate that sexual assault cases are both very difficult to prove in a court of law, and that the trial that Joe Biden has been going through is the trial of public opinion. And in a lot of ways, he was, the Democrats had Trump's sexual assault allegations, of which I believe there are 17 from 2016. And then they had, a series of sort of, I don't want to call them smaller Me Too scandals, because there were Democratic officials who were accused of things as serious as rape. But let's take Al Franken's resignation from the Senate in, I believe, early 2018. Franken was ultimately, voters were a little bit split about whether or not they felt like he should full on resign from office. If you look at polls from that period, a lot of Democrats thought, well, maybe he should undergo an ethics review in the Senate. What ultimately sent Al Franken out of the Senate was the fact that party officials, Democratic Party officials, notably his colleagues in the Senate, perhaps most famously Kirsten Gillibrand, and we can talk about whether or not that sunk her 2016 hopes, his Democratic colleagues said, you're out, you got to get out of here. Joe Biden, I think, is sort of benefiting from Al Franken's misfortune, in the sense that Democratic elected officials, I think whether they like it or not, kind of said, well, even if we assume that what Joe Biden is accused of is true, and I'm not saying that, I'm just saying even if we get into that headspace, it's better than Donald Trump. And so you see Joe Biden benefiting from public declarations by high-profile Democratic women in particular, saying, I stand with Joe, I believe Joe. And in some ways, whether we like it or not, because I think, there's the Tara Reade allegations are also mired in a lot of gray areas, but just from a pure party deciding, to use that phrase again, Joe Biden's kind of in this safe territory in some ways, because Democratic women in particular, and he's going to choose a female VP, he said, are standing with him and standing by him. And so in some ways that it almost absolves voters of having to make that difficult moral decision. They can say, well, you know what, Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, is actually a sexual assault survivor herself. And she says that she believes Joe Biden's version of the story. And she says she's standing with Joe Biden. You know what? That's good enough for me. And I don't like Donald Trump anyway. So there you go. But I do think it's a very interesting, after 4 years of the Me Too movement, if we're going to say it sort of had its roots with Donald Trump, the fact that we're kind of going back to sexual assault playing a big role in voters' decisions or in the election, it's kind of interesting, and an interesting cap on this 4-year cycle.
Justin, if you just wanted to come in on this to talk about, again, the response from the Democratic Party.
You know, I agree with what Claire has said. I mean, the Biden campaign, the vice president himself said, and he believes that women should be believed and trusted, and that these allegations need to be vetted and reviewed by journalists and by voters. And I think that the reason that so many of the people that have come out in support of the vice president around these allegations is because that they do believe him and they know him, and they don't think that this is within his character. And so you know, ultimately this is going to be a decision for the voters to make, and who they believe. You know, the Biden campaign and news organizations rather have talked to a number of former Biden staff about this and what they remember of it. And the whole thing is, as Claire pointed out, is kind of very gray and kind of ever changing as well.
Peter, if you could come in and talk to us about, again, what you predict to be kind of the future of this allegation and this issue in the next 6 months.
Yeah, remember what I said previously about predictions, don't make them. Look, couple of points. One, first of all, in politics, at least in the United States, I assume in Britain, these allegations of wrongdoing in general are often seen through your partisan lens. Let's face it, if the other guy does it, you automatically assume he did it, right, or she did it, and that you are much more willing to be vocally critical and jump to the next stage of why this person should resign or step down or what have you, or be defeated for election. And then if it's your person and on your side, you're looking for the reasons to why this story doesn't make any sense, and maybe I don't trust this story, and so it's natural, it happens, and that's where we're at. It's a sad situation, honestly, where the choice comes between a guy who's been accused of 17, 20, whatever instances versus my guy who's only been accused of one. But the truth is, just putting aside whether you believe Tara Reade or not, putting aside the substance of her particular case, if it is only one, that probably is different than if other people were to come out. What we've seen repeatedly through these Me Too instances is it's almost never just one time, right? If Tara Reade becomes an accuser by herself, and we don't hear any more revelations about her case that change anybody's mind, and there aren't more people who come forward between now and October, November, and say, yeah, me too, this happened to me, Biden did this, Biden did that, then that's one thing. And that becomes probably more politically, survivable. If obviously a wave of other women come out, that's a very different thing. But what it does for Trump is it allows him, or at least his people, to try to muddy the waters, right? Everybody does it, so don't pay attention to what I did or might have done or might have been accused of doing. And this is a great benefit to President Trump, because he can, he takes this issue off the table to some extent, because Democrats aren't going to want to raise the issue of his allegations of sexual misconduct, because it only simply braces their own candidates' allegations, even if they're not comparable, or even if they're different numbers or what have you. Similarly, that's what President Trump wants to do in terms of the Hunter Biden allegations, just to throw it out there and make sure the water is muddy, and it makes it harder then for Democrats to come after his family's mixing of business and public policy, his own kids who have benefited from his being in the presidency. It allows him at least to tell his own supporters, it may not convince anybody in the middle, but at least tells his own supporters, yeah, don't listen to people who are saying mean things about me, because everybody does it, they do it too. So we'll see. It's not a good thing, obviously, for the Democrats to have their nominee accused of something as horrendous as what he's been accused of. But again, I think if there aren't more instances of it between now and October, that puts it in a different light than if there will be.
Before we go on to talk about now Biden's choice for VP, I wanted to quickly touch on Justin Amash's brief candidacy. So on the 28th of April, Amash announced the formation of an exploratory committee to seek the Libertarian nomination, and he withdrew his name a couple of days ago on May the 16th. What does this brief foray by Amash represent, if anything? Justin, if you wanted to start.
I don't know. I mean, I guess it represents the displeasure by some traditional Republicans in the president. I mean, and we've seen this we've seen this there's still establishment Republicans that are never Trumpers and are actively trying to undermine his campaign, running television ads and campaigning against him. And I think it is an example of some dysfunction that's still left over in the Republican Party that came out of 2016, and something that that they're going to have to figure out and deal with heading into the election this fall.
Claire, do you see this playing to Biden's advantage?
You know, the whole Justin Amash thing is, I think it's both particular to Justin Amash, who's kind of his, I guess his personal brand is like, you know, I'm the thinking man who has left my party and kind of am standing alone. I'm kind of curious if Bernie Sanders had been the nominee, if Justin Amash's candidacy would have, you know, gotten a little more grist. You see, you know, there's something called the Lincoln Project, which is a couple of, I guess, never Trump Republicans who ran big campaigns back in the day who are pro-Biden, I think in part because Joe Biden is palatable to them and they think palatable to a lot of perhaps swingy voters. And they're kind of making these attack ads on Trump. They're pro-Biden, all this stuff. Part of me wonders if Sanders had won the nomination, if they would have said, I don't know, what do we do now? Do we find a candidate to be, do we back Sanders? Do we kind of do a protest candidacy, and would Amash have been that person? I think it's a little bit hard to say, but it is interesting to me that Amash, I think, ultimately gave his justification for dropping out because he said he'd heard loud voices on social media, which is a very 2020 thing to say. So who knows?
Peter, did you want to add to this?
Yeah, one thing that's interesting, I don't think Justin Amash means all that much, but I think what's interesting is that President Trump succeeded in winning, in effect, his nomination for a second term without any significant opposition within his party. Given how disruptive a force he is, given how much many Republicans don't like him, given how controversial his presidency has been, for him to be able to sail to a renomination without significant opposition is remarkable. He had three, I think, Republicans mount short-lived, relatively meaningless challenges to him, quickly dropped out, went nowhere, not even a tiny bit of traction for them. And it's important in part because in our history, in the last 70-some years, presidents who won, incumbent presidents who won a nomination without a fight won re-election or won the next election. The presidents who had a significant challenge, I don't mean necessarily one who was going to take him out, but somebody who was significant in some way, won a lot of votes in a primary or here or there. Those presidents who had that kind of challenge, they lost re-election, not because they lost the nomination, but because it indicated a division within their party, because it weakened them or what have you. And so that historical, barometer is interesting. I don't know that it necessarily means that President Trump's going to win this year, but it tells you something about the history of presidential contests. Now, the fact that he hasn't had that kind of opposition within the Republican Party is a testament to his success in taking over the party. He really is not a party guy. Let's not forget that. He was a Democrat. He was a Republican. He was a Reform Party candidate. He was an independent. He switched parties, I think, 5-6 times over the course of his life. He's not a lifelong Republican with a great degree of loyalty to this particular party. He happened to come along and take the party over. And it is a remarkable thing where that party is today compared to where it was 4 years ago. 4 years ago, you had the House Speaker, Paul Ryan, saying, I don't want to be anywhere near the guy. And you had Republican candidates and senators and congressmen taking back their endorsements because of the Access Hollywood tape. You had palpable discomfort on the part of the Republican establishment for this person who is now leading their party, and the divisions were enormous and obvious. They have now all basically uncomfortably, probably in many cases, come behind him. He's not their favorite. They don't like him all that much, but you hear almost no dissent within the established ranks of the Republican Party right now. The Lincoln Project is they're trying to get under his skin. It's very effective. They've succeeded at getting under his skin with these sort of very targeted ads. But the truth is, the Never Trumper movement didn't succeed, and he has captured the Republican Party. It's a smaller Republican Party than it was because a lot of Republicans left. and are supporting former Vice President Biden. But what he has done in terms of success and forcing at least solidarity within the Republican Party has been his probably most successful political achievement of these 4 years, and it helps him going into the fall. Whether it's enough or not, that's a different thing.
Turning now to this very key issue of Biden's running mate. So there is a long and impressive list of women, including Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Stacey Abrams, Kamala Harris, and recently Gretchen Whitmer, who are aiming to be Biden's running mate. To what extent is kind of appealing to progressive voters likely to be a consideration in this decision? Going to you, Claire.
You know, I don't know. I think I'm really interested in Biden's VP pick, in part because I think that there's a lot of different directions you could go, and it's perhaps one of the more visible campaigns for the vice presidency that we've seen. I mean, this goes on, you know, it's kind of, they'll always talk about the election of the Pope. There's campaigning, you know, but you don't see it. And I kind of feel like that's how the VP race kind of traditionally is. There are different options you could go. I mean, you see a lot of progressives pushing for someone like Stacey Abrams, even though I should point out, Stacey Abrams is actually kind of I'd call her pragmatic politician, in part because of the state in which she, you know, rose to power. But the idea of, it's very important for us that we have a woman of color be on the ticket. We think you should nominate Kamala Harris, who is, you know, I think a progressive when all is said and done, whether or not you know, I think people on the progressive left would take issue with that, but she's a pretty progressive candidate. And then you see Elizabeth Warren, you know, even kind of upping her VP bona fides by sort of saying, yeah, I'm kind of, you know, she's a little bit dropping the Medicare for all thing, right? Maybe I'm a viable choice. I think she and Biden kind of have a bit of a history, so I don't know if he would pick her, perhaps because of personal reasons. So there's the progressive argument, but then on the other hand, you know, someone like Gretchen Whitmer or someone like Amy Klobuchar goes back to that appeal to the moderate voter, right? I think it's no coincidence that both of those women are white and from the Midwest. I think that's a valid concern. You know, I think there's a lot of talk on social media and a lot of really big pushes to say the party has moved in a different direction. It owes women of color a candidate who looks like them, because those are the party's most faithful voters. But on the other hand, again, we have the Electoral College, and that's how we decide the presidency. And a lot of those voters are either white and in the upper Midwest, or they're white and they're in, you know, the Sun Belt. And I think we can't get away from the real, love it or hate it, identity politics is a thing in American life. And to go back to political pheromones, sometimes voters just vote for the person that they think kind of gets them. And you can get into kind of other things with, you know, people might say Stacey Abrams doesn't have enough experience, her resume is too short, things like that. But I really have no idea which direction the VP nomination is going to go.
Peter, what do you think? And specifically, what do you think about what Claire said about race, given that kind of 71% of the African-American vote on Super Tuesday went to Biden? How important is race in this decision?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Claire summed it up about right. I think there are two main theories of the case here. One is you maximize your own voters, right? You maximize the voters you came in with. That means try to excite younger voters. That means try to maximize turnout among the African-American, Latino communities. Try to make sure that people who are already Democrats turn out, that they don't sit at home. A lot of the Democrats will tell you that one reason they lost in 2016 was they didn't do enough to give Democrats, particularly African-Americans and younger voters, reasons to come out the way Obama had done in 2 elections. And so therefore you should play that maximizing card. In effect, that's what Trump's theory of the case is too. He's not reaching out to middle voters. He's done nothing in 3.5 years to try to build his base. He has simply tried to preserve his base with the idea that if he can pull that inside straight that he did 4 years ago, he can do it again with the same group of voters in effect. The second theory of the case for Biden is, what, as Claire just said, is, okay, you've got 4 states you need to win, right? The 4 states are Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona. That's where the election will be decided. What will make those states flip? What might make them flip is a more moderate a candidate like a Gretchen Whitmer, like an Amy Klobuchar, somebody who's from that region, who are proven vote getters. And I do think the idea of a governor at this time has a particularly extra resonance because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think is I'm forgetting who said it, was Justin or Clare, but the governors are hot right now, and they're showing that they are leaders, and they're showing why they matter. They have a higher profile. There was a survey the other day that showed in all 50 states, the governors had higher approval ratings than President Trump does. And so that's the added bonus, I think, at the moment of the value of a governor as opposed to a Washington figure. Whitmer obviously has been elevated because of the virus and because the president is targeting her. In fact, he's in Michigan today. He's going to Ypsilanti, Michigan today, where I think you might hear him say something about the governor there. So those are the two theories of the case. I don't know which one Biden is going to pick, but that's the main suspense. And I don't see why he should do it fast anyway. Let him take his time. It's the one card he has to play where he can get some attention. But you've got to do it in a way, if you're Biden, you don't damage yourself or the party in the process. You don't want to anger people because you treated somebody or perceived to treat somebody with disrespect or without taking their chances seriously enough or disrespecting the people who support them.
Justin, any final comments from you on this?
Well, I would say, the vice president is in a unique position. Of course, he held this job for 8 years in the Obama administration. He knows very well what it is and what the work that needs to be done there. I think that he has said publicly that whoever he picks is someone that needs to be able to come in and be president at a drop of a hat. The country is going to be facing, set aside the two political arguments and the kind of the conversation that Peter and Clare had. The country is going to be facing some major economic crisis, likely still after the election, and they're going to need to govern. And I think that also is important to the vice president, is having a partner that he can govern with, also someone that he's compatible with. And someone I think that has integrity, and we're fortunate in the Democratic Party to have a number of incredible women that kind of check all those boxes. I of course have my personal favorite, but the party is in a good position, and I'm sure the vice president's going to make a tremendous choice.
Thank you, everyone. Our question from the audience today is a very, very similar one to everything we've just talked about. I think it's particularly easy for you, Justin. So this one is from Jasper at Lady Margaret Hall, and he says, who do you think is the best running mate for Joe Biden? He says, do you need to push to the center or appeal to the left? But I think that's generally been answered. So starting with you, Justin.
Well, having worked for Amy Klobuchar for a long time, since 2004, and having run her campaign, I think that, of course, she's my favorite. I think she would be a tremendous vice president. But again, not to diminish any of the other folks that are on that list. We've got a deep bench in the Democratic Party. We've got a diverse group of women that could do that job. They would be terrific, and so I think we're very fortunate.
Thank you, Peter.
Oh, I wouldn't say who's best. That's not for me as a reporter to say. I would add one more thing to what Justin was saying, though, and I think that he's too polite to mention the age issue, but it is an issue. I think the vice president, if he is elected and inaugurated, would be 78 when he's sworn in. He would be 82 at the end of his first term. If there's a lot of suggestion on the part of people around him that he would limit himself to one term. And so it always matters that a vice president's ready to step in, but probably no more so than this year when he has to convince voters that the next person behind him is ready really from day one. And if not, even from day, anything were to happen in the 4 years, we're setting up for the nominee for 2024 for the party. Whoever he picks is automatically almost certainly elevated to that status. So it's a more consequential pick, I think, for vice president probably than we've seen really in a generation.
Any final comments from you, Clare?
Well, I'm probably in the same boat as Peter, where I'm not going to make a prediction as a reporter, but I will say, just to add to, I think the sort of, choosing a white moderate woman from the Midwest argument, I think is pretty clear. But, the idea of choosing a Black progressive woman, right? You could also make the argument that in 2016, Black turnout was down in certain key counties in key swing states like Michigan, right? The Detroit area, Black voters had a decreased turnout. Now, there are lots of theories about why that happened, but you've seen a lot of people on the progressive left say, well, if you can drive out Black turnout even by, you know, a few thousand in those areas, bam, you've got Michigan. So there is also that kind of electoral math from the progressive side of things. So I would be remiss in not talking about that as well.
Great. I think that brings us to an end of what's been a really, really interesting discussion. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. It's been a pleasure hosting you.
Thank you very much.